This is a demonstration of both incomplete stitches and slip stitches and how to fix them on the following row without taking anything out. I'm going to be using a contrast color here so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. And I'm going to demonstrate everything both with the yarn in my right hand, throwing or American style, and with the yarn in my left hand, or continental style or picking. So I'm working a couple stitches and then I'm going to make an incomplete stitch, which is when I don't do all of the normal steps. So I'm going to put my needle in, I'm going to wrap my yarn, and then I'm going to not exit the old stitch. Instead, I'm just going to take the old stitch off the left needle, which means the old stitch transfers to the right needle along with the new yarn that I've wrapped. Now this might feel funny. If you're trying this along with me, resist the urge to move this yarn to a different position. Notice it, pretend you didn't, keep going. So we're going to work a couple stitches normally just to give a little space between our mistakes. And again, I'm going to go in, wrap my yarn, take the old stitch off. Note that it feels weird, keep going. It's actually a great sign if it feels weird. It means you're unlikely to not notice this when it happens. Now I'm going to switch to have the yarn in my left hand so you can see what that looks like for folks who do that. So here I'm going to go in, I'm going to catch the yarn, and then the old stitch is going to come off my left needle, it transfers to the right needle along with my new wrap. Leave this here, resist the urge to fuss with it. And one more time, in, catch the yarn, take the old stitch off, and then I'm going to finish my row. Now, because I have a contrast color, this is going to be pretty obvious because I've got the wrong color on my needles. But also, if you look closely here, you'll see every place where I've got the mistake, the two strands kind of crisscross and there's a little hole underneath. And that's noticeable both on the knit side of the work and on the purl side. The hole is actually more noticeable to me on the purl side, not so much the crisscross, but something definitely looks funny here in addition to the color. Now I could undo the row and fix it that way, but I don't have to because this is easy to fix on the following row. So I'm going to do it switching hands part way through again. So I'm going to start purling. And I'm going to pause when I get to the mistake. And if you weren't sure if you're there, you're not there. Because when you're at the mistake, all of a sudden it'll feel like your needles sort of separate and fall farther away from each other than normal. And then you'll see this big hole and this big slanty stitch. Now, the color here is making it obvious what I want to keep and what I don't. But normally it's counterintuitive. And people think that this slanted stitch here is the problem. That's actually not. That's the new yarn that you wrapped on the previous row, and that's good. We want to keep it. What I don't want is this stitch here. And if I tip over the top, you can see it's kind of a longer stitch. Its base is down in the previous row. That's a clue that that's what you want to get rid of. But at this point, it's the second thing on the needle, so I'm going to tip over the top, catch that second thing on my needle, lift it up and over off the left needle, and also release it from the right needle because I don't want to keep it. It should be gone. It's from ancient history now. Then I'm ready to keep purling until I get to the next problem. And again, here I am. That's when I know that I'm at the spot. I tip over, use my right needle, catch the second thing on my left needle, which is that tall stitch, lift it up and over, off the end of the left needle, also off the right needle, and keep going. This might look a little stretched out because we've been pulling and tugging, but it'll work itself out. So I'm going to switch to the yarn in my other hand so you can see it if you happen to knit like this. So here I am at my problem. I usually just slide the working yarn to the back so it's out of my way. Tip it over, catch that second thing, which is the tall stitch from the old row, lift it up and over, off the end, and make sure to release it. That motion feels a little bit like a chain bind off, but in the opposite hands from usual. And then we purl along. Here I am, tip it over, grab the second thing, lift it up and over off the end of my left needle, release it from my right, and continue. And now I'm back to my regular number of stitches. They're all the right color. Everything's good. And I'm going to now show you a slipped stitch, and then we'll fix it on the following row. I'm going to change colors again to make it easy for you to see. So slip stitch is similar, but there's even less of the stitch that gets done. So I'm just going to knit a few stitches to get in from the edge. All these things can happen on edge stitches, but they're less common because you only have 2 edge stitches on a project, and they are a little bit trickier to fix there. So I'm going to put my needle in as if I'm knitting. I'm just going to jump to where I take the old stitch off the right needle and then I'm going to knit a few more stitches. So you can see the yarn's attached over here. Basically, I didn't do much to the stitch, I just slipped it knitwise from my left needle to my right. And I'll do it again. So I go in like I'm knitting, old stitch comes off the left needle, transferring it over. That looks quite similar if the yarn is in your other hand. So then I would just go in, slide it over. Sometimes we do that on purpose for some decreases or color work or texture stitches, but here this is just an accident because, you know, my yarn's slippery or my needles are slippery, or I kind of jumped and it just popped off too fast. Now, again, the different colors make it easier to see what's happening, but even with that, you can see some of these stitches are taller and kind of stick outwards on the fabric. They kind of jump out at you a little bit, looking at this knit side. And on the purl side, you'll see what we call floats. And a float is my working yarn, which is this darker color, where it skips a stitch. So you can see this float, it kind of blends into the purls, but it isn't quite the same direction. So it's attached to a stitch and then jumps entirely over this other stitch before it gets to the one on the far side. So that's my float. And they become more obvious as you work your next row. So starting to purl on the following row, I'm going to purl normally till I get to my mistake. So here I am at my mistake, and you can see I've got the wrong color on the needle. This stitch is also backwards on the needle, which is a clue that something's funny, and this float is more obvious now that I'm here. So what I'm going to do to fix it is I need to take my left needle and scoop up that float from front to back. And it's a little hard, so I usually just take my right thumb and kind of pull it up a bit and also stretch it a little to kind of build in the extra yarn that I need here. And my left needle scoops it up from front to back, and now this looks just like the incomplete stitches we did. So then I'm going to tip over the back, grab the second thing, which is the tall stitch, lift it up and over, and be sure to release it, and everything's normal. And here your needles do kind of feel like they fall a little wider than normal when you get to the mistake as well. So here's my float, and I'm going to pick that up going from back to front with my left needle. And that's really important to get the stitch correctly oriented so you don't end up with a twisted stitch after you've fixed your slip stitch. Then you tip it over, second one goes up and over, boom, and we're done. I'm going to do the last two continental style. So here we go. Here's my float, scoop it up from front to back, tip this over so I can grab this guy. It's just, you could grab it from the front, it's just a lot harder to fit in there. So there's more access here because that's where it's tall. Up and over, there we go. And here we are for this last one. Catch that float, take the old stitch and lift it over it, and then we're ready to go. Now, because we've been pulling and tugging, you might have some stitches that are a little tight or a little loose, but you can just give that whole fabric, you know, take it away from the needle tip so it doesn't endanger, give the whole thing a little wiggle, and that'll often take care of it. And if you happen to still have a stitch that's extra tight or extra loose, like let's say this one is, you could take a darning needle or a smaller knitting needle tip and kind of tug out some of the extra and share it with the neighboring stitches. So I'm going to pull a little less each time, so I'm leaving a bit of the extra behind in each stitch as I get to it, so that I'm sharing out the extra. So instead of that one loose stitch, I've got 5 or 6 slightly loose stitches, and it blends a little bit more. Things will also even out a bit more with blocking, so I'd only get this fussy if you really have something that looks like it's quite a bit larger, quite a bit smaller than the neighboring stitches.